Welcome back to another episode of For Your Health. I'm your host, Dr. Ronda Marie Chakolis-Hassan. Today we are here discussing a truly transformative community event, the Black Men's Healing Conference. This conference has impacted so many lives of men and families across our state, and this year's focus is on Black fathers. It is especially timely and vital. I'm honored to be here today with my dear friend and colleague, Sam Simmons, the visionary behind this work and a leading voice on trauma informed care in the Black community. Sam, welcome back again to the show.
Thanks. Thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure.
Sam, for those of you who are new to this conference, can you take us back to where it started and what inspired you to start this work?
Oh, good question. Um, what uh, inspired me and another gentleman to start the conference was actually started out with an argument, about who, how black men show up in the community. The question was, when we're talking about black men, how do we address that? And one of us was talking about the system and the issues around the system, and the other was talking about personal responsibility, right? And we had this kind of loud disagreement in the organization we was working in, and it was so loud the staff was scared to come in the office. They were standing outside the door to see what would happen. Okay, and so it got quiet. Folks freaked out, and the reason it got quiet, we came to the conclusion we were both right. You know, um, but the other thing we came around is the fact that uh, male trauma across the board, doesn't matter what background, is ignored. And how do um, if you ignore a whole gender's trauma, why are you surprised by the behavior they display against themselves and others they care about and love? And so in 2009, we put together a 1 day conference to ask the question, if we focus on black male trauma, would that open up an avenue for healing for the community as a whole, right? And in that 1 day, I think we had 135 people show up. Now granted, only 60 registered. So, 135 people showed up. And the surprising thing is 135, and I think out of that 135, I think there was 10 individuals, 10 white individuals that were there who knew about my work, who showed up and stayed and still support me and that kind of thing. But a lot of those uh, individuals of color that was there who lived in Minnesota had never met each other.
Wow.
And these were all practitioners. So that was the big piece around that. You know, it, if you focus on this and what would be the outcome? And that was the question all day. We had young people there, we had pastors there, and at the end, it was a great event, and we still actually probably have more video of that one than we do of any of them. And the thing that they at the end they said, when we have things that work this well in our community, they don't last long. So the promise was to keep it going, and so this is the 17th year. It's at times it's been a struggle, because it was hard to get funding about helping men, and particularly black men, deal with their trauma when we've been so used to punishing black men. And the other piece is not, we like to talk about systems, but we have a tendency to punish our men too
Absolutely.
by ignoring them or only calling on them when there's a crisis.
Right, absolutely. So 17 years is a long time, and you talked about really some of the great beginnings and how you had double the people that you expected. Of course, people didn't register, so hint, hint, people who are planning on it, participating coming up at the end of the month, it's important that we register. But you talked about these wonderful beginnings. What are some of the most powerful milestones over the last 17 years? I mean, I know initially it started out with 1 day. Now you're doing 2 days
Oh,
because it's a
yeah,
lot to cover. But
right.
let's talk about some of those milestones.
Well, I think the biggest milestone is we're still here for after 17 years. Um, I think the other piece is one of the things that's been interesting is people would come to the conference, when you put black men in any title, because they wanted us to change the title after the first one, and I refused to do that. When you put black men in the title, and we're kind of accustomed to this, the question always is, can women come? Right? Well, there's a lot of women doing the work, right? And if we don't get folks different kind of have a different kind of conversation about this, then how do we make it better, right? So can women come? Can people who are not black come? Because you put black and man in, and the thing is there's not enough for us to do the work. So the folks who are doing the work, we have a tendency to complain that they're not understanding us. Well, why don't you help them understand? Okay, and one of the things that the folks who are not African American appreciate, they and I know this is gonna sound weird, they felt safe
Mm-hmm.
in that environment. Think about that. You know, I'm one of them folks. I don't have time for good, right, and wrong until we deal with what is, right?
Right.
And the other piece around that is that black folks felt safe enough to be honest. We would have people on our panel like judges and police officers of color on panels, and people said, I never heard them speak so freely like that, and think about that idea of feeling safe. I think we underestimate that sometime as people of color. We sometimes more lately we talk about not feeling safe in places where we're like the one or two individuals in. But if we're going to get honest, we don't always feel safe in our own environment for various reasons. And a lot of it has to do with the trauma, the cumulative trauma of the community as well.
So, I mean, that's great. You're talking about how you've had community members, practitioners, judges, healthcare providers at these conferences. And then it kind of brings me back to what you were talking about is the mission. Like you
Right.
never changed the name after 17 years. What are some of the core values of this conference?
Oh my goodness. The core value is that um, a, the the core value is based on the idea when we talk about particularly the African American community, um, is and we talk about the disparities. We talk about the lack of money. We talk about the issue of oppression and all those kind of things, right? And then the last thing we end up talking about, unfortunately, is what black men aren't doing, right? And so the core of the mission really wasn't just about black men, it was about community. And what does community trauma look like? Because that issue of trauma, in terms of talking about the community, was a real, when we started, it was a difficult conversation. Because I would have people come to me, why are you talking about trauma? We're resilient people. Yeah, but ain't nobody supposed to be resilient for 400 years and not learn how to thrive, you know? And so if you were just dealing with resilience where, we talk about recover, the comeback, well, what if you're coming from a ugly place to start, but what do you recover back to?
Right.
So you got to be open to be honest about how does this trauma that we talk about often, especially when we're talking about particularly African American, and people say, well, why you say African Americans with slavery in their background? There's some unique trauma pieces, right? The interesting thing about when I'm doing lectures, even other people of color can see through our example some of the issues they have dealt with in this community very quickly, and they will say it after you made me think about, because because there's a nuance, right? If I'm a black immigrant, there's a nuance, right? Versus being an African American with American slavery and be able to track your family through that. There's nothing wrong with understanding the nuances,
Right,
right?
right.
And which will also help us understand some of the conflicts we might be having within the community of not understanding nuance, because for some of us, that idea of being uh, um, that victim-y kind of stuff, you can be a victim of a certain situation, but you don't want that to be your part of your personality.
Right, the narrative.
Yes, so the big thing is connecting the dots.
Right. And so, what I like that you're talking about is you also talk about the systems,
Right,
right? But you talk about some of the internal trauma that's caused by our community experience. For
right,
example, women telling men how to be men, or silencing people,
right,
or actually taking on these behaviors of oppressing,
right,
right? So, I think that's really important. One of the things that I notice, and your flyers are up here for the viewers to look at, is you have a lot of partnerships with organizations and individuals. Tell me about like the evolution of these partnerships and why are they so important in this work?
well, a lot of the continuous partnerships are some of the ones I had before I started the conference, right? And we gathered more over the time. But our partnerships are unique because we try to partner with folks who kind of get it, right? Are open to having open conversations, not just about the systems. Because again, I'm not going to ignore the systems. People, well, what about the system? I'm not going to ignore that. But there's a whole lot of folks talking about that. Let's talk about what's going on internally at the same time, so we can put ourselves in a better position to have these battles, right? And looking at the friction between black men and black women, right? And how has that occurred in trying to navigate this trauma that we deal with in the community, starting from the beginning. A lot of what we call culture is nothing but a trauma response, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's hard to hear, right? I mean, a more kind of simple one is when we talk about soul food. That was a trauma response. That that was a trauma response, right? And so the thing is then when later on we started learning about eating healthy and all this other kind of stuff, the first thing we wanted to be was offended that they were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what we call soul food. And well, they don't do that with other. Well, I don't have time to talk about what other people are doing, other than how do we respond to that. And luckily, over time, we have folks in our community who still do soul food, but they do it healthy,
Right.
or but understanding that even the whole thing around corporal punishment. I have my views one way or the other about corporal punishment. I don't tell nobody, but understanding the history behind that, understanding the fear. It's like this year, one of the things I'm going to talk about in my lecture is how we've been conditioned to parent in fear, and what does that look like, and how does that traumatize young people. And again, it's not that we deliberately, we got to take out that, because that blame. I don't have time for that. Again, I don't have that right and wrong. We got to deal with what is and work
Right.
backwards. There was what was behind that. Was it because they didn't love them? No, they loved them. And then you add the fear in of what might happen to them when they walk out the house. It's like I talk about the 1950s, because I'm old as dirt, but the 1950s and stuff like that, when especially down south, when you get a 14-year-old, how the 12, 13, 14-year-old think they grown, and I'm going outside. I ain't scared of white folks.
Mm-hmm.
But your parents realize what has happened.
Right.
And that's when you get them quotes about, I'd rather beat you than let them kill you. Think about that. So there's that fear in there, right? And that's them also really displaying their trauma as well, because we haven't left a lot of space to have those honest conversations. And on top of that, and with that, is sometimes we look at, if you ain't suffered enough, you ain't black enough. It's like, what the, all of that is, I think, is our over the time, our emotional way of not being disappointed,
Right.
in that kind of thing. And so what happens, and I talk to my clients about this, have you ever had another black person look at you and say, what do you got to be smiling about?
It's happened. And I mean, again, and I think you highlight so many important points, which is how we'll get back to the topic of fathers. We talk about discipline versus punishment,
Right.
right? And my personal viewpoint is punishment just teaches people how to be slicker and try to get away with things,
Right.
whereas discipline gives you a wider viewpoint.
Right.
And I think as a community, we've gotten away from discipline, and allowing people to really say, these are the reasons why. Like a lot of parents result to physical
Right.
punishment because that's the way they were taught, and they're like, I turned out fine, so
Right.
this is where we're at. But kind of circling back to your conference, the conference theme is about black fathers,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of misconceptions in the community about black fathers. Statistically, we actually know black fathers are want to be involved in the
Yes.
home and are in the home. And
Right.
an interesting statistic that I came across actually is that children tend to do better with single black fathers than they do black women. That was really something I just read in a journal article. But tell me why you chose the theme for 2025.
Bec- well, I chose the theme because we hadn't, and I was shocked at my own self. We've been around for 17 years, worked in the fathers movement and that kind of stuff. It's like, oh my God, we haven't really directly we talked about fathers, but this being directly talking about specifically black fathers. And so it's like I said, well, this is the year to do that, because last year we talked about families, and relationships, in how do we navigate those in the name of family. So that's pretty much how we came up with that one this year.
And what do you hope that people who are fathers or people who do the work that support fathers will take away from this year's conference?
Um, be being willing to set aside their own stuff to hear other people's views on that, right? And with a focus not just on systems, because we are involving systems and having deep conversation about it, but how to look at this a little differently in the community. I mean, it's like, for example, we have a whole bunch of programs that have family in the name but don't deal with men, right? Subconsciously, what is that telling fathers? Okay, I mean, if you got family in the name, and the only time, and then family in the name, the only thing we're dealing with is supposed to be mothers and children, and then you're not realizing subliminally you're telling them they don't count until you want them to count, right? I'm going to even challenge the whole thing about baby mama and baby daddy, right? I mean, if we look at the history from that, the term, right? It didn't start out as a good term. And in some ways, in my book, it still ain't,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, like, when I work with my men, I try to get them not to say that, to say the mother of your children,
Right.
because, the adage is how you see people is how you treat people.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even realize that subconsciously, that kind of thing. And then, how do we look at a situation where it doesn't feel like we are blaming one another for, like, single parenthood. We have often, when we have, we're in the summer, and unfortunately we start seeing more homicides and that kind of stuff, and we'll get folks and get on TV. What we need is more fathers in the home and all this other kind of stuff. And sometimes indirectly almost blaming moms for that kind of thing, right? But I think everybody has some pieces in there.
Mhm.
And but again, is yeah, we want to have fathers in the home, but at the same time, how are they going to be in the home?
Right.
You know, um, co-parenting. We got mothers who don't even want to have that conversation about co-parenting because of the issues they have had with the father of their child. You know, and so how do we make it safe for everybody to have a voice, and also elevate those voices that are out there who are just doing their thing every day, being quietly taking care of their kids? How do we elevate that and elevate it in a way that is more natural? It's like when I was married the first time, I was considered a father of the year. I was 20, own my own house, like, oh my God, because that messed up the narrative. Own my own house, had a couple of kids. I wasn't a good father. I was a great provider. I didn't have no emotional connection to my kids, and the emotional connection with their mom got shaky I don't, I was getting all this credit because I didn't look on the surface like the stereotype,
Mm-hmm.
right? But behind the scenes, I was on at work all the time, kind of like coming home because of the relationship. My father, see, the thing is, we get so narrow in how we talk. But, I deal with a lot of men who might not have a relationship with their father, that kind of stuff. I started realizing I suffer some of the same trauma with my father. He was in the house, but we had no emotional connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was in the house, and his only job was, my mother would say, they ain't had a beating in a while. And he would do it. And I asked him one time when I got drunk, why you do that? And he looked at me, he said, I had to live there too.
Wow.
And so we have to have these things are happening behind closed doors, but we
Right.
need to talk about them out loud. And it's one of the reasons I often like to talk about being old, but I'm lucky because a lot of my partners once didn't make it.
Right.
And being an old man who's in good health and look as good as I do, that's something.
Right.
But at the same time, how do we have that different kind of conversation that's not always so stereotypical, where it feels like what it means to be in children's lives and be active in children's lives, and folks letting them be active in children's lives,
Right.
because sometimes our fear won't let each other be active,
Right.
right? And when we talk about, we so much because of the national narrative, oh, single parent farms, and then we end up being the poster child. But my whole thing, in our current situation, we can wish and hope for two parent homes. That can happen, but we have to do a lot of work with young people,
Right.
right? And so my whole thing lately with some of my female colleagues who held on to bad relationships because of their kids,
Mm-hmm.
I said to a couple of them, I said, every child deserves one healthy parent. Are you healthy in this relationship? And the look on their face was like, oh.
Wow.
And neither one of them are married right now. And then their kids, one of them, their kids came to them, we was waiting for you to do that. We love daddy, but we know you and daddy in the same house ain't working.
Right.
But we was waiting for you to figure that out. And this whole time, they thinking, and I went through that same thing with my parents. My parents stayed together for 30 years. I was 12 years old and asked my mother, why you and daddy stay together? It's real clear to me, y'all don't like each other.
Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of just gets back to that point that we often talk about. So there's a lot of themes that we can take time to dissect. One, what you're saying is fathers need to be more than a provider. That emotional,
Right.
and the concept is called neural nurturing, really is important early on in our development. But you also talk about this deficit model,
Right.
right? Where, again, I hate the term baby daddy,
Right.
baby mama. those kind of things. It sounds like this conference is really going to focus on uplifting the real story of Black fathers.
Uh-huh.
Can you kind of just share briefly how you plan on doing that this time around?
Well, I like, the idea of uplifting, and the one mistake I'm not gonna make, and I don't think a lot of the folks who we got some really good workshops coming, but is uplift does not mean we don't tell the truth on the front side.
Right.
You know, because again, my way of approaching any of these problems is let's connect the dots. And you can't connect the dots going forward. You have to connect the dots going backward to understand under these circumstances, if you treat a whole group of people this way, why are you surprised with the outcome?
Right.
And why, it's like, and when we don't address the trauma, we end up being surprised by the outcome because we only look in one direction, right? If you only look in one direction and not look at the other, you're gonna get hoodwinked really fairly quickly. And so, yeah, we're gonna be uplift with truth and some techniques like relaxation techniques. We're, talking honestly with men in terms of the issue about how do they take better care of themselves. Okay, if they can take better care of themselves, that frees them up to think less selfishly. Because see, trauma causes self. If you're stuck in your trauma, it'll come out selfishly, and especially with men. Okay, male trauma is very selfish, extremely selfish.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you don't have no, because you hurt. And so now, how do I deal with that? Or in the whole issue around relationship, right?
Right.
How do you help young people? And see, I'm firm. We're talking about Black fathers, and when you, especially in this day and age, you say Black fathers, folks. There's a group of folks who want to assume that you are excluding other fathers,
Mm-hmm.
right?
No.
No, I'm a Black man. Why is it a problem with me having a conversation about my community and you automatically want to think that it's against yours? That's on you.
Right.
Okay? And so the thing is being honest about that difference because there is some differences. And again, I talk to different communities, different cultures. There's some similarities, especially communities of color in terms of how they feel in our society, but there's some differences culturally, right? And sometimes we even use that against Black men. Well, the Latinas this and the Somalis this and all this other kind of stuff. I don't have no time for that. We got to be honest about what we're doing. And one of the big things is how do you be in children's lives when you don't know how to be in a relationship?
That's something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, the men, they don't let me in and all that. But how do you know what was the beginning? What was the relationship? Understanding that you can have sex and not have a lot of kids. Or what does having kids mean to you? And for some of us, in terms of that trauma, having kids, I had one guy tell me, what about your longevity? Who's gonna remember you if you don't have a bunch of kids? And said it with a straight face. And one, I remember I was doing a thing in the prison, and we were talking about fathers. And they asked me, "How many kids you got?" I said, "Got one biological child." Let's somebody pop up, get the little blood test and pop up. I got one biological kid I know. I helped raise a few, right? And they said, "You only got one child. What about what about your longevity and all that?" I said, "Oh man, please. I didn't want to have a bunch of children, and especially outside of being married or in a stable relationship, because that's not fair to the kids,
Mm-hmm.
and then all the extra stuff that got to go along with that, And I worked real hard not to have a lot of kids, right?
Wow.
And but you don't do that subconsciously, when you're not having those kind of conversations on how to be in a relationship. Because see, the thing for me, if we're talking about parenting, we're talking about family, in when we're talking about trauma, the losers are the children.
Right.
And we have another generation of children trying to find their way. One other piece that we're going to focus on that, for some folks, believe it or not, struggle with a little bit is we're bringing in daughters. It's like we always have these conversations about fathers around sons, like daughters don't exist, and then want to brag about being a girl daddy and all this other kind of stuff. That's all great, and the young generation, the younger generation, doing, I believe, much better than mine. Okay, but we got one of our speakers coming in, wrote a book on the lessons I didn't learn from my father.
Wow, that's powerful.
You know, and then we have another young lady who does great work around co-parenting that I'm gonna have a on stage chat with about why is that important and the obstacles of that happening.
So it sounds like the conference is going to be using an intergenerational approach. And it sounds like the young lady you were speaking of is Alicia Price. Is
Yeah.
that and her message is really about what's her message about? Can you kind of tell me about that, your fireside chat?
Well, we're gonna, you know, probably the message gonna be on why it's important with the focus on children,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how do we do that? And a lot of her work is with women. She's doing some more work with men. And me and her have often had these conversations. We had a couple of them on my radio show too.
Okay.
I really impressed by her work.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And it also sounds like you've given us a great segue into your session. It's called The Invisible Wounds to Trauma Informed Parenting. Later on in this series, we'll be talking about some of the biological, physiological things that go with trauma.
Right.
One thing I was able to pick up from your talk, you were saying men with this trauma response from a clinical standpoint. I think about the fight or flight
Right.
and how it plays out in biology. And you
Right.
think about, you translate that to a relationship. Either people are fighting in a relationship or they're fleeing
Right.
relationships. I think one of the things I was really impressed about is your ability to have Dr. Nathan Chumlow
Right.
come and talk about and speak at this conference in terms of health equity. What do you hope his message will bring to the conference this year?
Well, open people's eyes about how do we involve fathers from, conception all the way through,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's been these identified times when we include fathers. Go sit in the corner until we call you and that kind of stuff. And then on top of that, when I call you, you have to act a certain way, right? And I think, you know that old adage, if they know better, they do better.
Right.
you know
And then you selected a keynote, and I believe it's Anton Johnson.
right.
Keynotes really set the stage for a conference. Why did you select him? What do you hope that he's going to bring?
Well, one of the reasons he got selected is one of our committee members, because we have committee members around the country,
Mm-hmm.
and one of our committee members out of Baltimore, New York, recommended him.
Okay.
And this young man has done a lot of work around working with fathers, getting them more involved in that prenatal care and those kind of things. And it because I wanted to bring in a younger voice.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometime as us old guys, we won't get out the way. And sometimes we need to get out the way and elevate young folks and be there for them when they need that support. Because you know, it just need to be right. And I trust my committee member. I've been working with him for almost 15 years. Met him in DC, and in the whole trauma piece, just like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And so that's how he got chosen.
And so, as we wrap up here, I just wanted to kind of circle back. First of all, thank you for the work that you're doing. It's been 17 years. It sounds like this conference is going to be very unique in the sense that we have this intergenerational approach.
Right.
You're able to gather people who are the deemed experts in their
Right.
fields, but most importantly, you have the experts who are fathers
Right.
that will be participating. Um, where can listeners or viewers go to get more information about this conference? I believe you have, like, what is your website? The
.com.
www.brothershealing.com.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm really excited to hear about what you're going to do next year, but most importantly, how you report back to the community from these events. I think it's really important that we have you come back or even bring a guest back with you so you can tell us how things turned out. As we close out, is there anything you would want viewers to take away from this?
No, well, the thing the big piece is if we want things to change, we need to have an honest conversation about parenthood, fatherhood, and how do we be more inclusive for the good of the children. They have to be the center of the conversation.
All right. Thank you, Sam. It's wonderful to speak with you again. Thank you, listeners. My name is Dr. Ronda Marie Chakolis-Hassan, and this has been For Your Health.